Hi, everybody. Hello, hello. Come on back in. I don't want you to miss this. Came all the way from Connecticut for crying out loud. Yeah. Is it chilly in here a little bit? A little bit. Okay. Good. I'm not getting sick or anything. Gosh, there's such a SARS concern in all the airports and things. So I'm just keeping an eye on that. It makes you nervous to travel. Huh. Well, hi, folks. I'm Bob Allison. I come from Connecticut, and I live out in Coventry. It's a little introduction about me. It's not all about me. This is about AM at the ARRL, but that's some of the specifics. I've been a ham since 1974. I worked in television as a broadcast engineer at the NBC station in Hartford for 28 years. And I've been at the ARRL laboratory for nearly 12 years. And I left television because I had this opportunity. I had a great job in TV, but I had this opportunity that I wanted to contribute to AM radio, a hobby that I love so much. And this was my opportunity to contribute to it. And so my regular job at the ARRL laboratory is I'm the test engineer for QST product review. And I just want to make it known that we have Rob Sherwood in the audience, and he's one of our laboratory consultants, and I really appreciate your help, Rob. I think everybody in this audience should give Rob a hand for his contributions to the improvement of technology of amateur radio. And my wife is a ham too. In fact, she's worked more places around the world than I have. And you know what? She wants a tower, and I'm not so hot on that. It's a lot of work. So how many guys have that trouble, huh? Okay. All right, so you guys talked about command sets before, right? I have lots of these, and in other places too. And back in 1981, I used to get the Fair Radio catalog all the time in the mail and loved that, and saw the command sets and decided I'd better, while I could, get the racks, the control boxes, everything that interconnects them to use them as they originally were. So that's one of my ham shacks. But everything there works. It's all been gone through. And here's ARRL headquarters where I work. How many of you here in the audience have been to ARRL headquarters? Okay, so if you ever come to New England, please stop by. It's an interesting place. It certainly is. And we try very hard to preserve and promote amateur radio. Everybody in the building is very dedicated to that. There's our laboratory, just a picture. It's usually a lot messier than that. But there's our screen room. That's the room that I work in. It's a Faraday cage. We have the latest test equipment that we get the numbers from. So it's neat and spiffy. That's the way I like to keep it too, by the way. And we have a museum full of boat anchors. And that's for all to see if you come by the ARRL lab. We have a nice collection. It's the ARRL Historical Collection. But we're here to talk about AM at the ARRL. Let's go through a little bit of history about AM and the ARRL. 1960s, W1AW switches from AM to single sideband. Okay. So no more AM out of W1AW. I don't know the exact date, though, but it was in the 1960s. Some of the directors were anti-AM, and I've heard stories from many, many AMers I've talked to on the air how they felt disenfranchised. It was unfortunate, but the technology was advancing. Look at the advancements that Wes Shum did. Again, narrower bandwidth, you could pack more signals on the band, no heterodynes. Oh, by the way, you know today's modern SDR radios, you press that auto notch filter and it's gone. One little itty bitty slice of audio, boom, gone. So if you're running AM and you have a heterodyne, you can remove that with a modern transceiver these days. Okay, 1990s, ARRL proposed bandwidths that further aggravated AM. Anybody operate AM here? A few, okay. But here's AM at the ARRL history. It's Bob Heil and Joe Walsh reintroduce AM to W1AW. That was in 2004. So, what do we have? Bob and Joe donated a Johnson Valiant and a National NC303. I'll show you a picture. And if you here familiar with any of those radios from way back in the day? Okay, a few. These are large radios. They're heavy. They take up a lot of real estate on your desk. But they're historical in nature, and they still run, and you can work and repair these radios. It's fun to restore amateur radios because you can get at all those parts in those old radios, except for that resistor that we just talked about that you need surgery for. But so Bob Heil and Joe Walsh donated some really nice equipment. It was trucked from California to St. Louis by Larry Kilman, WD9HHN, and restored by Larry Yaw, W9AMR. He's not here, is he? I wanted to shake that guy's hand. Did a nice job. So Larry and a couple of his friends drove all the way from St. Louis and delivered the equipment in June 18th of 2004. There's a little pictorial history. There's Joe Walsh on the start of the journey and the truckers. And then the truckers delivered the equipment to Bob Heil. Bob looks pretty happy. There's Larry. And, you know, that guy who's carrying the bulk of the transmitter, he's really grimacing because it is heavy. And there it is at W1AW at the time. So W1AW has had an operating amplitude modulation station. For anyone that wanted to operate that mode, if they wanted to come by ARRL and W1AW, they could operate AM. And that's a nice desk you got there. And gosh, that sounds great. This was nicely modified. The audio was modified in the Valiant to sound really, really super good. And the NC303 is just like brand new. And good news is it still operates extremely well today. Look at that. That's a professionally shot photograph, of course. That was taken while the equipment was in our new display room, which is the evolution of amateur radio equipment that's right off our ARL laboratory. So it's that long room that I showed you a picture of before. So the Johnson Valiant and the NC303 were in there for a while. We put it back over at W1AW for a time. We put it in a very hallowed space, and that is Hiram Percy Maxim's own roll-top desk. Okay, so AMers, we really had a special place for this stuff. And I liked it so much, there's my QSL card. So that's me in 2006 when I started as a volunteer tour guide at the League. Okay? I really wanted to have lunch with my wife, who also works there. She started in 1999. It was my plan to have time with her during the week, because I was always second shift, she was always first. So I volunteered. I got to know that place, the ARRL, during that year and a half, 2 years I was a tour guide. You know, I had some conceptions about the ARRL, what it was like, but I really had no idea until I actually was there and I met the people that do the work, and I learned how dedicated and serious they really were. And I'm glad I volunteered there because a job opened up in the lab and eventually, and I said, hey, I can do that. Okay, so here's a history of AM at the ARRL. Unfortunately, the AM equipment donated by Bob and Joe wasn't used very much. Nobody showed up to run AM. I was the lone person, it seemed, running that equipment. But I'd occasionally put it on the air during lunch breaks. Remember, I'm a staff member. I can't get paid and operate ham radio. At least talk on the air. I do it all the time in the screen room on a dummy load. All right? So our ARL historical collection was assembled and displayed in 2012, and so we put the equipment there. And then something really important happened, and that was back in 2016, where we sponsored the N1BCG event. You probably don't know what that is exactly, but this special event that occurred in Greenwich, Connecticut, commemorated this. It was the transatlantic tests, the original transatlantic test in December of 1921. it was the first time that amateur radio signals were heard across the Atlantic in Europe. There was stations in the United States were asked to transmit at certain times. They had to take times. They were scheduled. And ARRL sent an engineer named Paul Godley with a very, very specialized receiver, a homebrew super heterodyne. He also brought a Paragon radio, which is a battery set that would work on the 160-meter band. This is where this happened. But essentially what this transatlantic test proved, a couple things. One was signals could go all the way across the Atlantic via shortwave, via skywave. That was the first time it was done in 1921. Okay? And look at what else is up here. Here's the little list of 6 Spark stations, and the rest, all CW. And that goes to show you that that mode was more efficient than Spark. And the ARRL transatlantic tests proved the inefficiency of Spark, and CW was far more effective. There's the event. We had the Valiant there and the NC303. We also had a digital station going. We had some backup AM equipment. So we had modern modes. We had a flex radio there, and we had the AM radio there. And the public was invited to see amateur radio. We handed out flyers, but we were really showing off was the rich history that we have as radio amateurs. We go way back. So Clark Burgard is N1BCG. What's up with that little n? Well, Clark does that because he doesn't want to upscale 1BCG. Okay? They have a monument about a mile away from that schoolroom, that gymnasium that you just saw. There's a monument in Greenwich, Connecticut, and it's dedicated to the operators that operated 1BCG. They were from the Radio Club of America. And you also had Edwin Armstrong in that group of people. And at the very bottom of the marker, you see the names of those who were transmitting from Greenwich, received in Ardrossan, Scotland. That's where the receiving station was. That's where Paul Godley was. Gee, there's an interesting side note. Ever heard of Harold H. Beveridge? Beveridge antenna, right? Of all things, Paul Godley was sent over the Atlantic on the Aquitania. And on that ship, the Cunard ship, he ran into Harold H. Beveridge, who said, you know, you really ought to try using a Beveridge antenna out in Scotland. And that's what they used. But if you zoom into the bottom, there's some of the names, and the very bottom is Paul Godley. Paul Godley is this gentleman. Forgive me for the XX up there. I don't know what his call sign was. I couldn't find that. So it was 2 something at the time. That's Paul Godley with a Paragon receiver, an amplifier. That's just an audio amplifier, just a receiver. And that's one of the receivers that was used in Ardrossan, Scotland, to receive amateurs on short waves for the very first time. CW, and it would be in the vicinity of anywhere between 1500 is where the band started at the time, up to 2 megahertz. I don't know the exact frequencies. So there's our N1BCG station. On the right is Clark Burgard. And on the left, anybody recognize that person? That's ARRL CEO, ex-CEO. We seem to have a lot of those lately. That's Tom Gallagher, NY2RF. NY2RF was a supporter of this. We talked to Clark. He actually got on the air, picked up a microphone, and actually talked, and ran into Clark on the air. And Clark was explaining about this N1BCG event, and Tom says, why don't we sponsor it? So we helped out. We set up antennas down there. It was great. But that's Clark on the right, Tom Gallagher on the left. And Clark is responsible for, this is about the N1BCG event, by the way. So we used AM on 75 meters, digital and SSB, 3 stations. Oh, by the way, yeah, we contacted Ardrossan, Scotland, where the BBC television was set up to actually record and document the anniversary. Gee whiz, guess what's coming up in next year, 2021? 100 years of shortwave radio. How great is that? And 100 years of DX. Okay? That's a big deal. Let's hope we can all make a nice operating event out of that. Right, Rod? Yeah. Right. So Tom Gallagher came, and we made plans for the next AM event, which was the AM Rally. Now, the AM Rally features just AM, and we encourage all radio amateurs to just press that button on their radio. And we have videos about what to do. We have great promotional videos on this one website. And I speak of we, I mean this AM group, which I'm part of. But the AM Rally happens, it'll happen next weekend. Okay, it starts at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, or 000 hours UTC, February 1st. So if you hear those heterodynes, well, hit your auto notch, but tune in and listen up. So we've been doing the AM Rally. It's spearheaded by Clark Burgard, N1BCG, Steve Cloutier, WA1QIX. By the way, Clark, he invented internet radio, and he provided a feed from the top of Mount Everest and broadcasted that over the internet. First person ever to do that. So he's very notorious and very famous in some circles in broadcasting. Steve Cloutier, WA1QIX. You know what that guy does? Alexa, Alexa, where am I? Alexa, he programs Alexa for Bose. That's what Steve does, so he's a big help. These are the kind of friends that really help us out a lot. And Brian Crest, KB3WFB, a big AM fan, very helpful with producing promotional videos, Hollywood quality stuff, really good stuff. And the website, sorry it's in blue, but www.amrally.com. Check it out, write it down. Everybody with a pencil and paper, write that down. Check out the website. And that website includes the promotional videos. So let's move along here. AM Rally, a premier operating event, first week in February. Activity in all, most of the HF bands except for the WARC bands. That's mostly where the activity is, in established operating AM windows. It's not a hello, goodbye, 5973 event. It's, hey, how you doing? What kind of equipment are you running? And the antenna and stuff like that. Then we move along to the next event, contact. And of course, the fun part about listening in, even if you don't transmit, you listen in, you get to hear some very historical transmitters. World War II transmitters, truly antique transmitters from the 20s, and all the way up to modern Class E solid state AM transmitters. Okay, it's held in, the first one was in April, by the way, 2017. We had some pretty high noise, unfortunately, and we had to use a remote receiver the second day. We got hooked up and we could hear a lot better. But we made 178 contacts for that first year on 80 and 40 using the K7DYY Super Senior. That was reviewed in QST. I got to review it. And we got to use it on the air here. And the K7DYY is Class D modulated transmitter. And it's very fussy. It needs a perfect 50 ohms. If you go above 1.4, 1.5 to 1 SWR, it'll just strip off and protect itself. So we adjusted for 200 watts. It runs all day long, and it runs pretty good at that power level. And if you want to look at the review of the K7DYY transmitter, AM only transmitter, it's published in September 17, the product review. There it is. The K7DYY is that little device right up here with the fans. There's a little digital readout, tells you what frequency you're transmitting on. It has a VFO, basically. And we used a 75 S1 as a receiver. So, but now things changed just a little bit. I'll just back up a little bit earlier that year. There's a man by the name of Brian Belanger, and he's from the National Capital Radio and Television Museum in Bowie, Maryland. Brian called us up and says, hey, guess what we have? Do you want it? It's a Gates BC 1T. That's a 1 kilowatt AM broadcast transmitter. There's a little switch on it that says 250 too, so don't get too excited yet. Okay? So he says, do you want it? And I said, yes, you know, because Tom Gallagher, after this N1BCG event, said, Bobby, you got to get me one of those transmitters. Okay? So I did. I found one. And so Brian called up just by chance. And, he also asked the Vintage Radio and Communications Museum of Connecticut, VRCMCT. Okay? And I just happened to be a board member of that museum. Okay. So we made up a really nice deal. Okay, the museum up in Windsor, Connecticut, WB1GCM, they own it, and the ARL uses it. This kind of protects it to make sure that, if we don't need it or we can't have it in the lab anymore, it's going to revert back to the museum. And it's preserved because we're trying to preserve some of this old equipment. So, and we're in the business of preserving equipment up at that radio museum, the Vintage Radio and Communications Museum of Connecticut, vrcmct.org. Here we are removing a 5 kilowatt Westinghouse transmitter from the rickety old transmitter building filled with water. 5 kilowatt Westinghouse from 1939, very Art Deco. It was too beautiful to see it destroyed, so we got it out of there. And so we went down to the museum, though, and we picked up, that's where the museum's housed in Bowie, Maryland, but the BC1T transmitter wasn't there. It was in a rickety old Nike missile site storage building. Yikes. And they had little access in and out, if you know what that means. There's the first look. Now, if it looks like this picture is from a video, it was. And if you want to see this video on YouTube, I want you to do this. Write it down so you remember. I have to write everything down these days, that's for sure. So, you want to search this. WA1HLR. Hotel Lima Romeo. WA1HLR and ARRL. Put those two things up in the search box. You'll find the video and the whole story about this Gates BC1T transmitter. First look, though, was pretty scary. And we did get it back to back up to Connecticut safely without anybody getting hurt. It's 800 pounds. By the way, that K7 DYY transmitter, it weighs 8 pounds. And it'll put out as much as that can legally. So imagine that, 8 pounds versus 800 pounds. All right, so about the Gates transmitter, a little history. It was operated at KPGE 1340 in Page, Arizona. Playing country music for over 30 years, just a happy little transmitter. Yep. But it was finally retired in the mid-90s. And it ended up, it actually had ridden on the back of a trailer on its back all the way across the United States, bumping along on the back of a trailer all the way to Maryland. And, yeah. And then it was just kind of stored there. So, it had a lot of red Arizona dirt in it. We thought it maybe had been stored outside. There's a lot of red dirt. And Maryland squirrel's nests, because as I said, that rickety Nike missile site building had lots of entrances and exits, and there were all sorts of nuts in that thing. Yikes. So, but it was restored to its original broadcast condition by our volunteer at the Vintage Radio and Communications Museum of Connecticut, Dan Thomas, who's an ex-broadcast engineer. He cleaned it up. He and his crew cleaned and cleaned and cleaned and cleaned. And anything that we did to that transmitter, let's say the ARL or anybody else, all modifications must be reversible. Did you save the nuts? No. But the modifications are reversible in case this reverts back and is a museum piece again. And when we started working on it, that's what we found. So that's how you keep a 1 kilowatt station on the air 24/7 without any fuss at all. So we had the AM rally in 2018, and we made 380 contacts. We hadn't restored the gates yet, but this is, again, AM at the ARL. We hadn't restored the gates yet, but we used the K7 DYY for a second year in a row. This time we made 380 contacts, and I talked till I was hoarse, and I finally gave up after that. And we used the Flex radio for receive because it has great flexibility with its filter bandwidth, and it's a great combination. And we put up a new antenna above the parking lot at ARL headquarters for 80 and 40 meters, so which worked really well. And that's the station in 2018. We put everything nice and neatly into a rack, as you can see here. The K7 DYY is there with the Flex radio monitor. The Flex is in the very bottom of the rack behind the desk. You don't have to see it because it only has an on-off button. and Sennheiser microphone, and an audio system which consisted of a limiter, compressor, and an equalizer. You see, the K7DYY, without any kind of limitation on bandwidth, any external control on it, will naturally be 10 kilohertz either side. That's 20 kilohertz wide. That's pretty wide. Maybe during the day when the band is dead, you can do that, but at night, when the band's packed full of signals, like we all hope the bands will be, you want to kind of narrow up that bandwidth. And that's what the equalizer is for. You can narrow up the bandwidth of an AM transmitter with a good equalizer. And that way, you're not hogging a whole bunch of the dial. And that's what we ran. And I'm pretty happy. Yep, I made it through there and had a good time for that event. So after the AM rally, which was February of 2018, I called up New England's best transmitter engineer, WA1HLR, Tim Smith. Anybody know who Tim Smith is here? Timtron, okay? He's a kind of a strange character. One time, I drove him from Augusta, Maine, when my wife's in the car too, all the way up to Monticello, where he works at WBCQ, which is a shortwave broadcast station. Tim pressed the microphone button down, so to speak, but nonetheless, he started talking. As soon as we got in the car and started rolling, he started talking, and he didn't stop until we got to Monticello. It kept me awake. It was a 3.5-hour drive. So, okay, long-time AMer. He's in Skowhegan, Maine, WBCQ transmitter expert, real character, very genuine, and I'm proud to say he's my friend. That's Tim. Yes, he's wearing a kilt. That's a man very comfortable with himself. And that's him standing in front of WBCQ's Gates 50 kilowatt transmitter. Yep. And by the way, about 2 weeks later, it burned up in a spectacular fire, and that whole room burned up. That's what happens when tubes go, and you have fiberglass all around as a plenum, and it made a smoky mess. There's Timtron in his shack. He lives in Skowhegan. It's lots of boat anchors, so he's been teaching and an aficionado of old equipment for a very, very long time. I started listening to him in 1974. Okay, and we invited him to the lab. We got him a lab coat, ARL official lab coat he put on. And there he is. He's working on some of the modifications. What did we have to modify? First, the frequency-dependent components. It's a crystal-controlled transmitter, so we have a crystal in it right now. We may use the flex radio as an exciter for the gates, and the gates as an amplifier. But what Tim did, he took the driver coil and he took some turns off of it, and he figured out exactly how much to use by trial and error because he used a grid dip meter. And that's the same tuning condenser and the same configuration as it would be inside the gates. He had another carcass that he had brought down, and so we're able to have a couple of extra parts to work on. And so he brought down that coil so it would resonate on 160 and 75 meters. And he installed it again. There goes the grid coil into the radio. Again, this is all on that video I just mentioned about YouTube. It's a pretty entertaining video, I think. And that's the finals in the Gates transmitter. They're pretty big tubes, 833As. So it's a pair of 833As on the output modulated by a pair of 833As. The tube drivers for the modulator are 807s. There's that's a difficult picture to take, but basically I held the camera out in front of me inside the transmitter, and I aimed the camera straight up to look at the tuning network. And that was the other area that Tim had to reconfigure, again, so this would load up on 75 and 160. It would just make it up to 160 without any modifications, but we had to get it up to 75 meters. That was the purpose. So he added one of these big old capacitors right there. He had a couple of these, they stacked them up over here, and then he moved one strap to another. He did some magic. I don't know exactly off the top of my head. And I know you'd like some more details, but I don't have them for you. But it's pictures, and you can see all the beautiful hardware that's in that Gates BC1T transmitter. There's the power supply on the bottom. And so you have some pretty large filter choke on the top right, and the modulation transformer on the lower left, high voltage power supply part on the lower right. And there's other things called modulation reactor and other things in there. Low voltage power supply too. And Tim did something which was very important. Because this is a broadcast transmitter, they really weren't worried about stray capacitance for the lines running to the final amplifier tubes. And what Tim did was he shortened up the path between filaments and these capacitors right here. So you want these filament bypass capacitors. These were all kind of loose originally and just dangling in there with long straps. He simplified it all and put this little angle in here, which was a piece of a Gates transmitter. And then he strapped the filament bypass caps to that, reducing all that stray capacitance, which makes it very hard to tune, etc. So the transmitter has a very, very nice, clean dip to it. There's the audio drivers, 807s. And our first on-air test was February 22nd, 2018, the first tests. And worked the first time too. And so we had a good afternoon talking on the Gates transmitter and testing it out on the air. We made some adjustments and worked out pretty well. And then later in the year, Tim came back to ARL headquarters and he installed a TR switch. And we have this whole transmitter running just on one button, push to talk, with the Gates. So he's working away, and there's Steve, WA1QIX. He's working on another part of the project. And we added a very, very nice audio chain to this transmitter. There's Steve in his shack. I think he likes old stuff. And I don't know what happens if you just yell really loud in his house, "Hey, Alexa." There's the audio system that we have. We have microphone mixer, equalizer, something called the Dominator, which is a peak limiter. Then we have this Innovonics speech processor, which is made for broadcasting. And we have a audio distribution amplifier on the top, so we can feed the audio to the K7DYY transmitter and the Flex if we needed to, and of course the Gates. Specifically, here's the lineup of that audio system. Sennheiser microphone. Just a very inexpensive but effective Shure microphone mixer that was rack mounted. The Dominator peak limiter. The Innovonics 222, well known in broadcasting circles. We have an Optimod 9300 that we're going to be putting in there, donated by Optimod. Audiometrics DA, and of course, that's to feed the Gates, the Super Senior, and the Flex 5000C. And I had a pretty good time talking on it. That was in 2018. Steve has this really cool little modulation monitor software that he designed and built. It's advertised in QST. Let's see. AM at the ARL in 2019. We made a few more contacts, and we had guest operators this time. And guess what? Most importantly, I got to work Bob Heil. Yep. And now I have Bob Heil's QSL card on the side of the Gates transmitter. And we encourage all AMers who contact W1AW, and while we're using this Gates transmitter, we encourage everybody to send us a QSL card. And we'll send one back, of course. And that looks really, really, really good. So we had guest operators, we had great press all the way around QRZ, our own ARL website. But most importantly, remember what I was saying before, AMers felt disenfranchised by some of the past attitudes of some of the ARL directors in the past who were anti-AM. Okay, that doesn't exist anymore. The ARRL promotes all modes that radio amateurs enjoy. And a whole boatload of them enjoy amplitude modulation. It sounds great. Again, you have that heterodyne, just turn on the auto notch if you can on your SDR. You get an old vacuum tube transmitter matched up with an SDR receiver, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you get the best of both worlds. And I've coined this name, our Gates is the AM ambassador. Ambassador. It's been our ambassador to the AM community to prove that we're not anti-AM. So if you have anybody that says, oh, the league hates AM, please tell them it's not true. Please. And I'm quite happy. Look at that. How great is that to have that in the lab? Mind you, I operate it during off hours. I'm busier than all hell working on product review the rest of the time.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
What's the TMC antenna tuner?
That is not an antenna tuner.
No, it's the watt meter.
Up there?
Right?
Yeah, that's what we use to watch our power. That was donated by Martin Ewing, who's AA6E. He ran the Yale Computer Lab for 30 years, and he happened to have it. It's from 1960, and it's a cross needle. It's a cross needle watt meter. And below that, you see that little black thing right there? That's a General Radio modulation monitor, model 1931A, and it was made in 1931. That works perfectly, and that was removed from service from a local radio station and donated to the lab. All right, for 2020, we operated the Heavy Metal Rally. That was January 5th. Electric Radio Magazine. Anybody heard of Electric Radio? Yeah, some people advertise in it. And that's a great magazine for people that like to restore the old hollow state equipment. I highly recommend it. It's been published since May of 1989. Okay, so we were in the Heavy Metal Rally. Our AM rally starts on February 1st at 0 hours. Okay. Now, later this year, the plan is Timtron's coming back. He's going to install a band switch. Because the only way to switch bands, of course, you have to change crystals, but there's this big roller inductor. You got to turn and turn and turn and turn and turn, and all that time your plate's waiting for a dip. So he's going to install a band switch, okay? And we had all this hard line donated to us, and we have these small little tunnels under the parking lot. We're going to run hard line from the lab to all the antenna systems at W1AW, so we can access their antennas. And so that'll be an improvement too. And what's going to happen beyond, okay? People are asking, gee, Bob, what happens when you retire? Well, we hope that everyone else is going to pick up on this enthusiasm. And already we have a nice group that is going to come up and stay with us on the 1st. We're going to have 3 couples operating, male-female operations. So nothing snags the DX like a nice YL voice, I'd say. That works out very good. Clear and distinctive modulation. That should sound very good. So we have 3 couples coming in and a couple of other people. It's going to work great. The AAWA AM operating events, February 15th. But the future operations depend on staff availability, okay, volunteer availability, and period, abilities. You know, I hope all of you share your information. All of you. There is so much information in this room. Please make sure you find that one special person that's interested in this stuff. He or she may have an inkling that they're interested. So don't let that drop, because it's your job to make sure all this kind of stuff is preserved. You like this stuff? You must pass this along to future generations. You have to. So find that person who's interested in it, that young millennial. Give them a good hobby that will last the rest of their lives. So, if for some reason we don't use it anymore, the Gates is going to be saved, and it's going to be brought back up to the Vintage Radio and Communications Museum of Connecticut. But we don't expect that. And as a matter of fact, we seem to be building on a pretty good operating event. So I hope you all take the opportunity next weekend to listen to some of the AM windows and see what you can hear. You'll probably hear Bob Heil on the air, and maybe some of you folks too. Okay, here's the accomplishment though, and this is the last slide of the presentation, okay? About the ARRL, well, this is just one of the examples of the work of the ARRL. I'm not here to promote the ARRL. It's not my job in this forum. but I'm proud of this fact. Because what happened, it's success achieved through volunteerism. People have put in a lot of time and effort and their knowledge to do this project and to make it successful. These volunteers, okay, take pride in their favorite mode, and they've done that. It took membership expertise. Our membership is vast and has a lot of knowledge. This room is full of knowledge. Okay, you can hear and see the results on a pan adapter. And the history of the legacy mode of AM is further preserved for future generations. But what I really like about this is the cooperation that occurred to make this whole project happen. And it took a number of people all coming together. We had to coordinate that. That was my job as just project coordinator. I really didn't have to do a whole heck of a lot. And it worked out great. And I hope that you have the opportunity to come to Newington, Connecticut sometime, and you get to see the work of the Aero Laboratory and also this fine Gates BC1T transmitter, plus all the other cool stuff we have going on too. Any questions? All right, and thank you very much. Any questions? All right, thank you.